There was a heavy silence on the line after James had asked that all-important initial question. His weight pressed down on James, despite the casual tone the participants had so far taken with each other. Something that wasn't exactly helped by the incessant stares of his compatriots, that James could feel resting upon him, even as he had taken to stare down towards his feet while taking this call, partly so he wouldn't get distracted, but also because he felt like loading even more stress onto his mind by looking back at them wouldn't exactly further great decision-making. Granted, he was nowhere near close to his breaking point yet, but it was still wise to lessen the strain whenever he could reasonably do so. The picture of the strange look that the local soldier that had picked up Kahrfuem earlier had given him had not left his mind just yet. In a situation like this, why exactly would the sight of an unrelated party elicit such a reaction? Veselon remained silent for what must have been a good 20 seconds before their voice could finally be heard again. "Yes, I am familiar with the situation," they replied to James's inquiry quite casually, although James imagined an air of tension in their words, one of which he couldn't be quite sure if it was real or just wishful, or maybe whatever the opposite of wishful thinking was on his part. "Actually, this is quite the coincidental timing you have chosen to call me about it." James cleared his throat for a second, feeling it suddenly become dry as he tried to answer. "How so?" he finally managed to get out, trying to make the question sound incidental in nature, as if he were just trying to catch up about something. "That's not important," Veselon replied almost instantly. A bit too quickly, in fact, as if hastily trying to correct a mistake. Had they said too much already? He still felt like antagonizing the supposedly masterful hacker in their current situation wasn't exactly the best course of action to take, and also remembered their usually quite extreme reactions to anything that could resemble an accusation. Thus, James decided to play things safe for the time being, not immediately jumping at their perceived mistake. Of course, he still didn't know where Veselon's current allegiances lay, if they were actually behind this whole thing. However, they had wanted to be his ally in the past. Maybe that desire was still there. "Well, anyway, no idea how informed you are." He approached the topic carefully, not letting any suspicion on his part slip just yet, but apparently there was some error in the station system that allowed all of this to happen. I don't think the situation can be entirely resolved this way now, but still, fixing that issue might actually help us to know exactly what we are dealing with here. Knowing who is and isn't actually supposed to be on the station will certainly help narrowing the numbers down. And as this happens to be somewhat in your field of expertise, I was wondering if you possibly knew a way to help out with that. Believe it or not, I'm not too inclined to just trust Kahrfuem to deal with it properly. That last part was a half-truth. If he didn't have to, he had absolutely no interest in intervening with the local law enforcement's efforts to handle the situation. After all, he had always been and still was just a visitor here. However, he felt that possibly appealing to Veselon's animosity towards the man could possibly help sway their mood in his favour even further. Even though he didn't need to look up to know that there were quite some curious glances being cast at him by some of his surrounding friends and co-workers after his words. This was likely not the kind of conversation most of them had had in mind when they urged him to make this call. Veselon once again took a bit longer than could be considered polite to reply, somehow cementing the image in James's mind that they were either distracted by or busy with something in the background while they were trying to speak with him. "Do be assured that that bunker should be perfectly safe for you and your company to wait out this incident in," they finally said, after the disconcerting pause, entirely avoiding his earlier question in the process. "I highly doubt the protesters will be able to breach it without outside intervention." Underneath his mask, James squeezed his eyes shut. "So, you already know where we are?" he asked sincerely, quite certain that tracking down this specific phone was basically nigh impossible, but certainly not affording the same luxury to those that his compatriots carried with them. "I saw you entering through one of our cameras," Veselon replied after a 5-second break in the conversation. "One of our stores overlooks the entire street." James had no idea how true that statement was, but even if he took it as gospel truth, the fact that Veselon or even someone who was working for them just happened to check that specific camera feed at the time was a bit too convenient to not be taken as suspicious. But even then, James decided to refrain from calling it out again. In fact, he was pretty sure Veselon knew about that fact themselves, and him drawing their attention to it would have exactly zero positive effect on the matter. For now, the both of them would just silently agree to play dumb with each other for the time being. Clearing his throat again, James continued. "Alright then. So, About my earlier question. Hold that thought. Aveslon suddenly interrupted him before falling silent for yet another time. This was getting tiring. This pause would also prove to be much longer than the previous ones, and no careful probing or subtle attempts at regaining their attention from James showed any effect on rectifying the current state of events. This caused him to finally lift his head and look up again. The room had significantly cleared out by now, with only a skeleton crew of guards remaining to stand around in this entrance hall, while everyone else had been led further back to presumably relax and catch their breaths in peace. That was, everyone except Loijivar, who had been left behind by Kahrfuem's welcoming committee earlier, and was now patiently waiting in the entrance area like a loyal dog. In all honesty, James was almost surprised that he and his company had so far not been probed to also get out of here by anybody yet. Said company stood restlessly around him, waiting for any possible turn of events in tight anticipation. That was except for Shida, who obviously still sat next to him against the wall. She had sunken into herself and seemed to almost doze a bit, with her eyes closed and face directed to the ground. Although, upon closer inspection, her ears didn't quite fit the image because they stood up attentively straight, and, if he really paid attention, James could even see them move in little micro-twitches, seemingly minimally reacting to something they were picking up. Something that he himself could not make out. Even for her, with her in comparison, extremely sensitive hearing, it seemed to cost a good bit of concentration to do so. He was tempted to ask about it, of course, but seeing how focused she appeared to be on her listening, he didn't exactly fancy the idea of needlessly interrupting her. Of course, should his current conversation ever resume, he would likely disturb her whether he liked it or not, but still, if it was just about satisfying his curiosity, he should likely hold back until she had actually been able to listen to whatever she is trying to hear there. If it was anything at all, in the end. Who knew what sound she was picking up there? Maybe it was just a new bout of ruckus outside. She would probably inform him sooner or later. Please forgive me. I must split my attention a bit at the moment, but I do believe I might be able to be helpful with your troubles. Aveslon's even voice suddenly came back out of the phone speakers, making James listen up. However, the voice right next to his ear wasn't what really caught his attention in that moment, because almost coinciding with it was another, admittedly much quieter noise. However, what stood out a lot more than its quietness was the fact that he could hear it at all, considering just how muffled it sounded, indicating how loud it must have been at its source to reach all the way to his ears. A scream, an outcry of anger, an almost primal noise that had escaped someone within the confines of the bunker. A sound like that didn't belong in a place like this. Although, if it ran out here anyway, that could mean anything good. Next to him, he noticed Shida look up in surprise as well. Moments before everyone's heads suddenly, unsubtly, turned towards the perceived origin of the noise, which happened to be just about in the direction that Kahrfuem had taken off to earlier. James, Aveslon quickly probed him after he didn't answer immediately, much to his annoyance since they had so far barely responded to him, without leaving a pause in between. What did you have in mind? He replied anyway, although he probably did still sound slightly distracted, as he exchanged a curious glance with Shida next to him, wondering if she could give him any insights into what had just happened. The look on her face spoke of slightly spooked concern, as her yellow eyes unsurely glanced back at him, having seemingly sunken a bit deeper into their sockets, while her ears had folded back ever so slightly after bearing witness to the much louder noise that had interrupted whatever she had been listening to before. Her mouth stood half open, as if she was in the process of trying to say something, but had stopped herself before a sound actually emerged from her lips, leaving just her fangs to cheekily peek out from behind them instead of words. However, seeing me look back at her now, she started to mouth something. And although James wasn't exactly a gifted reader of lips or anything like that, he was almost completely certain that her lips formed the word, or more specifically the name of, Kahrfuem, as she did so. Was that who they had just heard? What could have caused him to lose his cool like that? It didn't seem like the White Lion at all to have an outburst like that. I'll have resolved the issue in a bit, Aveslon meanwhile went on unperturbed, not even pretending like that task could even imaginably cause a problem for them. Once I have done so, it should be easy enough for the local law enforcement to deal with the situation. It sounded more and more likely that the mystery person was the one who orchestrated this whole thing. In fact, it seemed less and less like they were even trying to hide it from him. Any idea how long it is going to take? He asked tonelessly. I don't fancy being cooped up here for too long. Aveslon giggled. It was hard to decipher the sound they made. It certainly sounded like some form of laughter. However, it was nothing like the general tones of amusement that James had by now gotten used to from Miat. It was high-pitched and perfectly even, not throaty at all and without a hint of wheezing. In fact, James could barely make out an exhale behind the notes of their voice, if at all. "Well, I can't guarantee for how fast the forces will be working," they finally explained, after their strange fit of amusement had come to an end, their voice immediately turning steady again without so much as a grace period. "But the error in the system is resolved by now." So far, James had only met one person in his life who could go from laughter back to talking perfectly at the drop of a hat. And although Curie's voice generally sounded the part of being artificial, his memory of their second voice generator, which they only used in a storytelling fashion and which he therefore had only witnessed himself once, was very vivid in his mind at that moment. The question was just who was using said voice box here, and why? Also, apparently they hadn't been kidding when they said they would have resolved the issue in a bit. It seemed like they barely needed to do more than simply flip a switch, in fact. Almost like it had been right at their fingertips this whole time. It had gotten to the point where it was becoming hard to even play dumb about it anymore. Luckily, Evesilon took that duty off him before James had to make the decision whether or not he should confront them about it this time. "I'm sure you have many questions," they said calmly. "I will be able to answer some of them, but not right now. In fact, it would likely be better if we ended this call rather swiftly, although please believe me that I am sorry for the inconvenience." Apparently, his input on the matter didn't concern the mystery person, because before he could even voice a thought, the connection had already been cut. They had simply hung up on him. Honestly baffled, James removed his phone from his ear and looked down at the device, reconfirming for himself that the call had actually ended. Usually he would have likely been furious at such a behaviour. However, in this case, it just left him dumbfounded. Just what explanation could that crazy person possibly have up their sleeve that made them expect that James would ever be willing to even remotely let an incident like this go, while still acting in their favour afterwards? After all, in the best case, they had grossly neglected concerning themselves about his safety during this little stunt, and at worst, they had just thrown him to the wolves. Still, he couldn't think about it for too long, because almost at that exact moment, as if perfectly timed once again, footsteps were audibly coming nearer, echoing from the building's thick walls. Wait a second. Loud footsteps? On this planet full of sneaky felines? Somebody must have really been agitated to stomp on the ground like that. Although, apart from that, you wouldn't really have been able to tell the part when looking at Kahrfuem's face, or that of his posse for that matter. Of course, all of the eyes in the room were still on him as he returned to them after whatever had caused him to have a screaming fit in the other room had apparently come to an end. Despite their calm, placid-looking faces and relaxedly hanging ears, however, his stomping gave them away. "He's been yelling at someone earlier," Sheila suddenly whispered into James's ear, as quietly as she could without being completely inaudible to his maladapted ears, leaning over and getting as close as possible to have the maximum chance of not being overheard in the process, even before that really loud one. James nodded, as his earlier question was now answered. Loijavar moved to greet his boss. However, Kahrfuem ordered him to fall in line with the people hurrying along behind him with an imperious gesture of his hand, to which the man clad in silver responded with some surprise. However, he still did as he was told without complaining, skulking along as the last in the line of people that were now making their way through the entrance area of the bunker. As soon as they had crossed about half of the room, James's guard sprung into action, forming up into a protective wall that separated the two parties from each other, as they apparently didn't like the assertive way with which the felines were approaching them. This in turn led to the soldiers surrounding Kahrfuem to also break from the established queue they were walking in, instead taking up position next to their leader. At that moment, everyone was grimly reminded of the amount of firepower that was concentrated in one spot, even in this supposedly secure location, as the two rows of soldiers faced each other down, standing tall while staring at each other, unmoving. Neither party was raising their guns. However, despite them behaving quite amicably towards each other so far, it seemed that there wasn't exactly much missing for at least one side to start considering to do so. Kahrfuem, who seemed mostly annoyed by the display, shoved his way past his own soldiers after the strange standoff had established itself, barking some incomprehensible orders at them while taking a few steps in front of everyone and approaching the human soldiers in a dignified manner, pulling and stroking the plates of his segmented armour into a more orderly fashion as he walked. "What's with this nonsense?" he then loudly but admittedly collectedly demanded, with a harsh look in the masked faces of the primates before him. None of the soldiers felt like they owed him an explanation for doing their job, as they simply stared back at the man with a serious expression projected onto their visors. However, behind them, James had already pushed himself back to his feet, and he now loudly announced that it was okay for them to part a bit, so the feline could tell him whatever had brought him back out to them quite so soon. Dutifully, the soldiers parted, although they always remained in positions where they could intervene right away if something was to happen. "I'm sorry for this, Ambassador," Kahrfuem immediately said, once James had come into a reasonable distance for a conversation, and he spread out his arms in a welcoming gesture that made the glided metal on his torso sparkle in the light. Immediately, the honorific use of his title made James suspicious of the man's intentions. An unfortunate mishap, and that today of all days. However, rest assured that our top-of-the-line information experts have already resolved the system issue, and our police forces, with help of the military, are already hard at work in cleaning out the malefactors. Hopefully we won't have to stay for much longer, but for the time being, it would probably be best if you remained here until the situation is resolved. Well, apparently one of his two conversation partners was a bold-faced liar, and somehow James had a feeling he knew which one of the two was more likely to be the one telling the truth. At least this made the decision of whether it would be the right thing to do to tell Kahrfuem who exactly was messing with his systems there a lot easier. After the error miraculously occurred, and then just as miraculously fixed itself right after, there was no way his people didn't know that the system was being tampered with. Information which, especially given his situation, really should not be withheld from James under almost any circumstances. So, if the man wasn't going to divulge even that much to James, he didn't want his help in the matter anyway. Besides, James still wasn't quite so sure about just how little Kahrfuem actually knew in the end. Maybe he wouldn't be telling him anything new by revealing the name of the hacker behind the attacks, or at least the name they were acting under towards him. An interesting thing to specify, James suddenly heard a voice from behind him. Slightly turning his head, James could see Sheila look up at the exchange from her place leaning against the wall with a sharp curiosity. She hadn't really moved from her earlier position. However, she was sitting up a lot straighter now, and her entire body seemed to be filled with a certain tension that had not been there before. Like a loaded spring, just waiting for the right trigger. Not exactly like the plan for us was ever to simply walk out of here before things were clear. She wasn't wrong, although James admittedly didn't know how wise it was to so directly bring it up. The fact that Kahrfuem had come all the way out here to essentially tell them that the plan hadn't changed was indeed a bit weird. Granted, he had also announced that the problem had been partially resolved, but wouldn't it have been enough to simply send someone out to do so? Why would the big man himself interrupt his work for such a lowly task? It seemed that Kahrfuem was just going to wave off Sheeta's concerns, if he didn't just flat-out ignore them through his efforts to not even look down at her. Meanwhile, James scanned the faces of the accompanying soldiers that still remained at Kahrfuem's side, even if they were now standing a few steps behind him. Especially the one who had stared at him so strangely just minutes ago caught his attention. Through the obscurity that the breath filter provided James's face, it took the man a couple of moments to even realize that he was currently being stared at. However, once he did he ever? Although he managed to suppress staring at James with wide eyes like the saints alive this time, James still noticed the man nervously avoiding it to look at his mask directly, while also shuffling his feet a bit, and, most tellingly, his tail began a slow, even movement from side to side. Now the question was the military personnel of this high-class Deathworld that lived mostly isolated from the rest of the galaxy really that easily made nervous? James honestly doubted it. Even mere civilians didn't seem easily moved, so why would the military be? And if his doubts proved to be correct, then did the man have a reason for his obvious nervousness under James's gaze? Despite presumably knowing already who orchestrated this incident, James still felt like there was something about it that he exclusively was unaware of, and it started to really gnaw at him. If there is anything we should be aware of concerning our safety, or especially that of the Ambassador, it is imperative that you please share it with us, so we may act accordingly. Andres suddenly spoke up as well, after Kahrfuem seemed determined to not react to Sheeta's earlier statement. James didn't know if the Major had also noticed the same nervousness that James had seen on the military man's face, or if Andres had just generally read the room and decided that it was important to clear some things up, However, he demanded said information with all the authoritative prowess that his long training provided him, while still sounding astonishingly empathic in the process, like James could only dream of while giving orders. Meanwhile, Sheeta had finally sprung up from her sitting position and was now taking up a spot together with the rest of her human company, standing to James's right while still remaining behind him, so he could only see her from his periphery. "You are perfectly safe here," Kahrfuem assured them with calming hand gestures. And quite honestly, his words had just about the exact opposite of their intended effect. Despite having no rational reason to think so, the more he was assured that this place was safe, the more James believed that staying here would actually be detrimental to him. Somehow. Then again, what was he supposed to do? Just walk out there into the protests? Not that he couldn't. He was confident in his group's abilities, but not without a rational reason. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he could see Sheeta's head snap around as she suddenly stared up into a corner of the room, and a quick gander around quickly showed that she wasn't the only one. Many of the Miat that had been less transfixed than James, including Loijavar among others, had also turned their head in the same direction. Although, whatever it was that had caught the feline's attentions like that, it seemed that none of the humans had noticed it, at least not until they followed the feline's gazes. James followed the gazes and spotted a camera? Certainly looked like one with its tubular shape and a lens at the end, while being affixed to a seemingly flexible arm connected to the wall. Could have technically also been a lamp, but the lamps in this place looked quite differently from it. Still, James couldn't quite see what was so attention-grabbing about the thing, apart from maybe the fact that it was looking right at them. And the second that he thought that, the camera suddenly moved. And maybe he had imagined it, but now that he was paying attention to it, he could have sworn that he had also heard the movement. The almost imperceivable whirring of teeny tiny engines working on the inside to move the thing seemed to accompany it. Imagined or not, the movement this time has something to it that now also made Kahrfuem look up at the thing with a jerky movement of his head, which was fitting, since his recent adjustments seemed to have moved the camera in a way that would stare down right at him. Not that a camera in a place like this was anything noteworthy in and of itself. It would have been a lot weirder had there been no cameras around here, in fact. Still, everyone's reaction to it gave James pause. He could see Sheeta being startled by the sudden movement of the camera for a second. However, the people controlling this place should not be this captivated by something that mundane for this long after it happened. In fact, it seemed like some of them were not just astounded at the movement. No. Many of the Miat soldiers were sweating bullets. Their tails started to sway around nervously as they took uncertain steps to the side, so they could more easily stare up at the camera, seemingly refusing to blink for as long as their eyes would allow them as they did so. James's guards clearly didn't like this development. However, they also didn't quite know how to react to it, as they were just as clueless as to what was going on as James was. They just knew it probably wasn't good. Kahrfuem managed to keep himself together for the most part, his composition holding firm as he did his best not to let any of the nervousness or uncertainty that he very clearly felt seep through his demeanour. However, even he muttered a single word under his breath. "Impossible," Sheeta almost immediately translated for them without needing any prompting to do so. "What is?" Admin was the first to come out and ask, as the air in the room grew heavy. Every single primate now stared at the white line in the gilded plating, as the camera moved for a third time, looking over the masked group of offworlders this time. Finally, Kahrfuem managed to rip his gaze loose from whatever had so shocked him about a camera moving in a bunker, and he immediately turned on the spot, pushing himself through his soldiers once again while hurrying away from the group of humans, without answering the proposed question. Not happy with this, James immediately moved to follow the man. However, his progress was halted as soon as he even came near to the feline soldiers, who decidedly blocked his way from advancing any further. He was about to protest, when suddenly Loijavar let something slip, and honestly, James wasn't sure if it was on accident or not. "She can't be serious," the man in the silver clothing mumbled to himself, taking another glance up at the camera. Somehow, Kahrfuem's right hand seemed to be far more composed than the military around him, or even the man himself. Does she not realize what this can mean for us? Maybe there are answers to be had yet. "Who are you talking about?" James asked the man directly, turning towards him and just ignoring the wall of soldiers standing between them. Loijavar pressed his lips together and looked around in contemplation for a moment. He He even threw a glance in the direction which his boss had just disappeared in, as if thinking what he would have to say on the matter. However, finally, the man made an insincere sound. "I'm sorry, I think telling you that would be against your better interest," he disclosed without looking at James's face. That confirmed it. They definitely knew what was going on here, and something made them afraid of James finding out. Something which he felt Avezalon would also know. So, either they wanted him to find out, or he was merely here as a form of pressure. Or maybe bait. "I don't think it's up to you to say what is in our best interest," she'd have piped up, apparently taking special offense to that statement, as she took a fretting step towards the assistant, although her path was of course blocked by the soldiers in the way. Still, that didn't stop her from glaring daggers at the man, while her tail frettingly swung around in a challenge to dare and contradict her. While she had everyone's attention pulled onto her, Andrej momentarily leaned in towards James. "I think it might be wise to tactically retreat at this point," his artificially warped voice whispered in James's ear, switching to English so the Miat wouldn't overhear the conversation. "I have a feeling things are just going to get hotter and hotter from here, especially if our contact is willing to push their luck. We'd rather not stick around for that." James contemplated that, his mechanical fingers accidentally colliding with his mask as he raised them in an unconscious attempt to scratch at his chin. "Won't that compromise our position in future negotiations?" he wondered back at the Major, while distrustfully eyeing Lord Javar and glancing in the direction Kahrfuem had once again run off to. Andrej cleared his throat. "We won't be part of any future negotiations," he reminded James of the fact that any further action would be taken by other representatives of Earth and humanity's interests. A bit more seriously, he then also added, "Besides, our safety is still top priority." James nodded. Of course it was. However, "What about the protesters?" he asked, thinking back to the quite reckless display they had witnessed earlier. Were they humans, he wouldn't have worried about it. Human protesters would scarcely mess with an armed squad of soldiers these days, no matter how mad they were. However, these people were Miat, and Miat were not only very fast when compared to humans, they also seemed to be quite used to the idea that they wouldn't get shot, even when messing with armed foes, as long as they didn't overstep some sort of line that James didn't know yet. After all, surely the soldiers weren't armed just for fun. There had to be a moment when they would be compelled to pull the trigger. "I think we can handle those," Andrej still assured him, surely not oblivious to these factors either, and admittedly, they had been through worse situations together. The two of them were also not talking nearly quiet enough for the rest of their team not to overhear them, and there seemed to be no protest against the idea. Apparently, James wasn't the only one that had felt less and less safe by the moment for a while now. James's final look was at Sheeda, and the way those soldiers were looking back at her. Hardened. Nervous. Definitely not good. James finally nodded. "If you refuse to tell us what has all of you this worried despite our allegedly secure location, I'm afraid we can't stay here any longer," he announced, taking a last step forward, backed by his soldiers, and building himself up to his full height, which meant that he towered over every single one of the Miat. "Please open the door for us. We are leaving." It didn't seem like the Miat soldiers wanted to budge at first. However, apparently they weren't quite to the point of trying to physically restrain the ambassador yet. So although they nervously squirmed or stepped in place and made all kinds of faces as they did so, they ultimately unwillingly stepped aside to make room for James and his company as they approached the large gate. Lord Javar immediately started to pursue them, walking quickly next to James while presumably trying to talk sense into the primate. "This is madness," he accused, incessantly gesticulating with his arms or trying to get James to at least slow down in his firm march towards the exit. "The unrest is not yet under control. You would be in serious danger if you went out there. For the sake of the relations between our species, we cannot let that happen." James looked coldly at the man. "It is my decision to leave, and that much will be clear in the footage of all the cameras my soldiers are so dutifully wearing at all times," he explained, and pointed towards Admir's body cam, mostly because he was standing closest to him. "Your concerns are noted and appreciated, but unnecessary. We can take care of ourselves, and right now relations between our people will be strained far more by you keeping us here against our will." By now, they had already reached the large entrance gate that separated them from the outside. "Tell your guards to open up the gate," James repeated his demand, coming to a halt and staring down the silver-clad feline, or towering over him in both physicality and demeanor. "I don't want to have to ask again." By now, the Miat soldiers had also started to move again, quickly catching up to the moving processions of humans, and positioning themselves protectively around Lodjavar. It came to a repeat of the earlier standoff. However, where it was fueled by a mere bad feeling earlier, this time there seemed to be real hostility in the air. James sincerely hoped that not one finger of any of the involved would twitch towards a weapon, because right now, he didn't feel like even an empty threat would have a chance to end well. "I can't," Lodjavar replied, shaking his head incessantly, while apparently still trying to remain diplomatic. "Not without Kahrfuem's permission, and he'd never approve of you doing something reckless like that." The man didn't get to finish his sentence, because his input was no longer necessary. With the deafening hiss of enormous pneumatics, and the groan of multiple tons of metal being set into movement against their inertia, the door behind James's back began to open, light flooding in from the outside in a steadily widening field. In disbelief, Lodjavar took a step back, the incoming light reflecting in both his polished silver clothes and his wide eyes that stared at the opening gate like he was seeing a ghost. "This is madness," he repeated his earlier statement, although it didn't exactly feel like he was talking to James this time. Either way, it seemed that somebody had decided that the humans would be free to go if they wanted to, no matter what Kahrfuem's thoughts on the matter might have been. Then again, the saying was not to look a gift horse in the mouth, but did this come too easy? A quick glance outside at least showed no rioters in the entrance's direct vicinity, so that was one thing less to worry about for the moment. The question was now which uncertainty he'd rather be dealing with, and at least one of them had promised him answers, he figured. It also didn't seem like any of his team were perturbed enough by the sudden opening of the gate to suddenly change the plan, and in the end he was just very glad that he wouldn't have to try and force the door open under threat of weapon fire, not that that had really been an option. "Move," James ordered, before the gate could change its mind and close again as suddenly as it had opened. Some of the Miats seemed to twitch with their weapons, possibly in an attempt to stop them, but Lodjavar basically threw himself before them, finally swinging his arms to swat at any barrel even threatening to be raised. No matter how desperately either he or Kahrfuem had wanted to keep them in the bunker, it seemed they too shied away from using force to get their way, just like James would have done. Still, they didn't turn their backs on the felines as they left, just to be sure. The parting was far from amicable, but in the end, as the humans walked away backwards and constantly kept the best eye contact their masks would allow them with the Miat, both parties kept their weapons lowered and, ultimately, it remained non-hostile. The first human-Miat conflict was narrowly avoided, merely by both sides' unwillingness to be the one to start it, while their quarrel was externally resolved by a third party deciding who was in the right for them unprompted. Although, as the humans had gained a good bit of distance already, they could suddenly hear the familiar sound of heavy footsteps, although they were a lot faster this time. Soon after, Kahrfuem appeared in the midst of his fellow compatriots, his pale figure clad in gold standing out like a parrot among ravens. The slightly out-of-shape man breathed heavily as he stared after the leaving primates, having apparently exerted himself in his sprint towards the door. For a moment, James feared his arrival might herald a shift in the mood, and they would have to prepare for an altercation yet. However, thankfully that was not the case. Still, there was something in the man's eyes that James had honestly not expected to ever see there. Honest, wide-eyed panic. The man that had remained perfectly calm when James had accused him of colluding with outside forces to the detriment of his planet, now seemed to be quivering on his whole body. And somehow, despite the distance and the surrounding, far-off noise of the ongoing unrest, James could still understand him perfectly well as he spoke, apparently addressing someone unseen. "What are you doing?" he said accusingly and in a hostile tone, although he apparently lacked the strength or commitment to once again yell out his words. "Do you want them to raze this entire planet to the ground?"